All right, I'd like to introduce the panel that are going to help me answer some of the questions that we have, and I'd like to invite Zahra Nedjabat, who is the Head of International Relations and Diversity at DW. Welcome. We're also joined by Moky Makura, who's the Executive Director at Africa No Filter. Thank you for joining us. And digitally, we're joined by Caleb Okereke, who is a journalist, co-founder and managing editor at Minority Africa. He's joining us from Nigeria. Thank you for joining us. And last but not least, we have Adam Han, who is a senior lecturer or associate professor at the University of Bath in the UK. Now, oh yes, welcome. Just before Russia's tanks rolled into Ukraine, or just after, the reporting and coverage was intense. And one of the things that was said was, and I quote by a journalist, "This isn't a place, with all due respect, like Iraq or Afghanistan, that has seen conflict raging for decades. This is a relatively civilized, relatively European city where you wouldn't expect that." Of COVID and COVID testing, a French researcher said on the air, "Shouldn't we be doing this study in Africa where there are no masks, no treatments, no resuscitations, a bit like it was done elsewhere for some studies in AIDS, in prostitutes? Why try? We try these things because we know that they are highly exposed and they do not protect themselves." I'm giving you this as examples of some of the things that we've heard said on the air based on stereotypes, and it's sort of a continuation of the conversation we were having earlier. So I'd like to invite Adam Han to start off this conversation because you're actually researching why people stereotype, and I think it's a great place to begin.
Thank you. Thank you for this introduction. Yeah, so I think to understand why we stereotype or what stereotyping is, it's important to understand that our basic cognitive systems, when we look at the world, we just see colored dots. So part of what stereotyping is a simple organization of our perception. So we organize our non-social world by the categories we see. I can put the colored dots together and see, oh, this is an auditorium, this is a human, this is a TV. And that helps me recruit information from long-term memory on how I'm going to interact with these things. And we do the same things with social information. So when I see a person, I categorize them as male or female. That might be important to me in a dating context. And as coming from a specific country, as belonging to this category or that category. And in the first instance, this still simply helps me understand the world. This helps me understand gives me expectations of whether I can talk to a person, whether they're going to be friendly to me, whether I should run away from them. And problems come in is that we obviously also make assumptions about what people from these different categories are like. That again can on a very basic level be helpful, but it can also lead to these wrong assumptions that we make. So for instance, on one hand, there's always more variability within groups than there is between groups. So many will have heard that, for instance, women have better social skills than men, independent of where that comes from. Now, the problem is that women vary a lot from each other with how many social skills they have. So any given woman you meet could be very socially skilled and very socially unskilled. And that's the same for men. And when you average hundreds of women and hundreds of men, you find a very tiny difference in those averages. But any random two women you meet will differ more from each other than women differ from men. So the variation we find within any group, within any cultural group, is much larger than the differences we find between groups. And so when we apply these stereotypes as category information to humans, we sort of tend to disregard that there's so much variation within each group. And so we make wrong assumptions about people because they vary so much within each group. That's the first problem. And then the second problem is that the category information we have isn't a true statistical tracking of knowledge. So that used to be believed in the cognitive sciences, that we simply track the information we have. And so we've interacted with women like this and men like this, and that makes us conclude what women and men are like. But what really happens is that we pay attention to the things that we call salient in cognitive science. So some things stand out more than others, and they will influence our perception of what groups are like more. So negative information, for instance, stands out more than positive information. Most people aren't violent or criminal. So when someone becomes criminal or violent, that information stands out. Now, minorities stand out compared to majority group members by virtue of being a minority group in a given circumstance, in a given context. And so when minorities, for instance, refugees, do something criminal, that stands out much more than the thousands of refugees that don't do criminal things. And it also stands out more than a majority group member doing something criminal, because two salient things are coming together, two distinct attributes in the situation become salient. And so our idea of what we know about people from different cultures, from different countries, are more representation of what information was salient than true statistical differences. So,
Yes,
sorry.
please go on.
No, I was just going to summarize. So the basic principle of stereotyping comes from the fact that we categorize our world to make sense of it. The problem comes in that we tend to disregard how much variation there is within each category, and that our images of these categories is more based on salient information than true differences.
Okay, so Zahra, if stereotyping then is a condition, I suppose, of being a human being, how does it manifest in newsrooms, be it from how we hire people, who we are putting on the air to talk about what? How does it present?
Hello?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, as we heard, it's a leftover of evolution, how our brain is wired, and no journalist is automatically having a different type of brain. So it's like a muscle that we need to train every day, fighting gravity, because there's a lot of time pressure in newsrooms. So often we go for the first choice of images that pop up. And a lot of monitoring that we do recently, we see that still the images that are used, 80% are male images when it comes to politics, sports, economy, whatever. So what we do is that we start counting, for example, with a method called BBC 50/50. This is a tool where we first of all raise awareness in the discussions of the teams, who to choose as an expert, as a panelist, and so on. And by this, to raise awareness. Also, we started to use more artificial intelligence tools, but the technology will not do the job. It needs to be first rooted in our brains, in our decision making, and to go this extra mile, it takes more time to go deeper into the images, the second, the third, the fourth round, until you find a woman or a person from a minority group. And I just talked to Manuela, our editor-in-chief, that it's, yes, this pressure of time and this highway in our brain that leads to fast conclusions is the biggest enemy that we need to combat. Also in recruiting, we need more time to go to different networks, to recruit even different people in the jury who recruit other people, because this homogenic groupthink doesn't lead to better decisions.
All right, so I'm already hearing that there needs to be very deliberate effort to combat stereotyping. Moky, I know that your organization has conducted research into how harmful the stereotyping can be as when it comes to publications and distribution of news. Do you want to share some of those findings, please?
The research we did wasn't so much into the, the impact of it. It was more looking at the data to show that these stereotypes, despite all the effort and all the knowledge we have, they still exist. And what we're interested in is the impact of those stereotypes. Why should we care? I mean, why should we care? The point is, and I'll start with a story. I was on the train coming here, and there was a gentleman from Sweden who was here on business who was talking to me. And I asked him, what do you think about when I say Africa? And you could tell he was trying really hard to think of something. And I said, no, just tell me whatever comes to your mind. He goes, oh, okay, great. Yeah, it's a poor continent. There's a lot of poverty there. I think a lot about the droughts and, it's a hard place. And that is the danger of that stereotype, because he's never been to Africa before, but he has these opinions based on what he's read and what he's consumed. The point is that those opinions inform his beliefs, those beliefs inform his actions. And what we see increasingly is that those opinions that come from these stereotypes inform investments into Africa. How many people, and I'll talk for someone like Bill Gates, spends billions of dollars on Africa but doesn't have an investment in Africa, right? The vaccine policies, I got stopped from going to Portugal because they did not accept a South African visa certificate. I had a Pfizer certificate. vaccine. I took it in a proper place. But Portugal didn't recognize that because they thought that vaccine certificate was somehow from a broken country, broken health system. So the point is, I don't want to get, COVID. So I'm not going to inject myself with something inaccurate, or wrong. But the point is that these things really do have an impact. And you see it with the way Africans were treated in China during COVID. The irony of that, African students were booted out of hotels, they were locked out of their accommodation because they thought Africans brought COVID. You can see it in the way Rwanda is being treated. The headlines around Rwanda right now because of this refugee deal they want to do the UK. So it really does have an impact, and that's one of the things that we are trying to counter.
Okay, Caleb, in Nigeria, I've heard it said, first of all, there's so many stereotypes about Nigeria. We could probably spend an entire 45-minute session discussing those. But some people have said, look, there's no big deal. Some of this are born from truth, and there's such a thing as positive stereotypes. What do you think of that?
I think one thing that has really changed my view of stereotypes is kind of taking it outside of the positive and negative binary that I was, taught in school, and it's quite common, right? So I'm Nigerian, but I've lived like a huge part of my life in Uganda as well, where I studied minority Africa, and I went to school in Uganda, journalism school, and I had excellent professors who taught about stereotypes, like at some point. But one thing that we really saw is this view of positive and negative stereotypes, and I don't think that it's quite accurate, right? So currently how I choose to engage with them, and the index that I currently use for stereotypes is a bit outside of that binary, right? So I kind of consider stereotypes to be either violent and less violent. And I think that sort of scale allows me to view and address the conversation with the severity that it needs, because it's serious. And I think in so many ways, when we say negative, it does not entirely equate violent, right? And our perception of something as negative might just mask it as a bad thing, whereas it is in fact dangerous and can lead to harm. Like Moky was saying, like these stereotypes they can actually lead to real world harm. So I think my first charge for us today is to kind of view stereotypes in a new way outside of the positive and negative binary. And even though like a violent scale sounds serious, it's because it is. And I think that sort of engaging with stereotypes in this sense makes us more cognizant of the fact that stereotypes exist across the spectrum and they constantly move. So every stereotype, I believe, has the potential to morph into violent, right? So
right. Zahra,
there's that inherent ability for like them to do that.
Zahra, you want to respond?
Yes, I would like to stress this binary point. On Sunday, we had this pre-discussion, and Yassir Khan, our dear colleague, he cited that a lot of times we see POC, for example, portrayed either as victims or as heroes, and we want to see them as peers and to have this much more balanced, non-binary view, and this is corresponding exactly.
Yeah. I want to bring back in Adam because, I mean, if we're saying the stereotypes, we all have them, we all perceive them, how can we engage in conversations about stereotypes without degenerating into personal attacks?
No, that's a good question. I think it generally helps to sort of acknowledge that a lot of people who do stereotype don't mean any harm by it, and then to teach people that harm still comes from unintentional, things that aren't intentionally harmful. So one way is certainly to simply educate people, and I think that's what everybody on this panel has been saying, to simply teach people that you will make assumptions even if you don't consciously want to have these stereotypes. Are usually automatic. We can show that in the lab. You can make people categorize people from different backgrounds in milliseconds, and people will be faster to categorize female faces with emotionality and male faces with rationality. And if you ask them afterwards, they will say, oh, I don't stereotype women, I don't believe that. And yet that seems to be automatically activated because we can show that on these reaction time measures. So stereotyping influences all of us in some way, in the sense that we organize our social world, like I described earlier. It's a different question of whether we then use those stereotypes and apply them and actually stereotype people live. And that's the point where we can intersect and try to teach people not to base their their judgments, their behavior on these spontaneous thoughts. And I think that was said earlier too, that one of the problems with journalism might be that it's such a fast-paced, high-pressure environment, and that might sometimes not give you the time to think through those automatic stereotypes and behave differently.
Is there a way, Moky, that newsrooms can implement a culture where, despite the fast-paced nature of news, that the people operating have a sort of checklist, a stereotype checklist, in order to not apply and perpetuate them?
It's funny you should say that, because we run an organization called Bird. It's like Reuters, but we specialize in soft news, feature stories. And I asked the editor to give me a list of all the phrases, keywords that we often come across from African journalists who are writing for us. And it was almost exactly the same as you would find in global media. And the point being that there is almost a language that has evolved around writing about Africa. It's little things like, war-torn Africa. It's even referring to the continent Africa as a country when you've got one or two examples of countries that are doing this thing. It becomes a trend across the continent. It's things like calling a slum as opposed to an informal settlement. It's things like looking at the words in your stories. Did you use the word poverty? Did you use the word malnourished when you're talking about, food? Did you, there's so many words. There's a list. There was a long list. And we're actually coming up with a style guide to show if you're going to write for Bird, these are the phrases that you need to either avoid completely or find alternative, less sort of, emotional, associations with those words, like slum. It just means so much. And I think it's really important, because what we realize is that journalists didn't even know they were doing it. It's become such a way of referring to the continent that, we just do it. So I think one of the first things is to make sure that people know when it's not right to use a word. For example, if we hadn't banned the N-word, people would probably still be using it because they didn't really think it was offensive, right? The K-word in South Africa, you can't use it anymore. So I think there's certain things that we as Africans, if we don't want people writing about the continent, referring to the continent in a particular way, we need to be articulate about the words that we find offensive or we find are not representative of how we want to be seen.
Okay, I see Caleb nodding, although Adam, we'll come to you later. I don't know if you can see all of us here. But Caleb, I wanted to just get your response on that, because we're talking about something as nuanced as language, but the implication can be very heavy in the areas where it's being discussed. Can you give me an example of how a negative stereotype could impact a community?
Yeah, I think with my publication, Minority Africa, what we do is we tell minority stories from across Africa. And this means that we constantly have to kind of interact with language that is very problematic, right? Whether kind of how we're seeing minorities being more broadly referred to. So for instance, we have certain stereotypes or certain language that people use to describe refugees and migrants sort of fleecing the system, right? Or as, taking our jobs, or we have stereotypes of, let's say, trans people as just trying to like usurp rights from like cisgender people, or of like gay people as predators, right? And so many of these things on the surface might seem like, oh, it's just Twitter banter, or we're just sort of debating on Twitter, but they do have, and they do lead to violence, which is kind of why I say that what I do envision to be like a much more accurate way to engage with stereotypes is to view them as violent and less violent. Because I think every single stereotype, from when we talk about like, oh, like Black women or like African women being sort of, numb to pain or being able to like endure more pain. And we saw many women say, oh, this means that my doctors don't listen to me anymore because they think I have a high threshold for pain, right? So it might start off as a harmless kind of like tea conversation, but it can definitely morph into violence. And it's very crucial for us, as Moky was saying, to be conscious of how our language can either, sustain or even create certain stereotypes.
Adam, I know that you had a response for Moky's statement, but piggybacking on what Caleb is saying, can there be a harmless stereotype? Can it be harmless?
Are you asking me?
Yes, I am.
I would argue that there can be. I understand that in these political contexts, but a stereotype can be something as small as French people eat cheese, or and I'm going to assume that they like cheese, or that food is going to be good here. I think that in most cases it can lead to a lot of pernicious consequences, but I'm not sure that this idea that all stereotypes are always bad is fruitful also for combating them, because we all do it all the time. It might be more fruitful to focus on the ones that we know are harmful, and so to know what we want to change. I understand the idea that, you know, even the root of any stereotyping is wrong, but I'm not sure if that is a battle we can win, you know.
Yeah.
So targeting specific stereotypes might from a pragmatic perspective might be the thing you want to do. The thing I wanted to say, yeah, sorry. I wanted to respond. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to ask: is Germans being efficient, is that a harmless stereotype?
Ooh.
No, I wouldn't say that because that has an evaluative connotation. So I guess it depends on that, whether there's an evaluation that comes with it.
Okay, this is getting very technical, so I'd like us to take a question from one of the fellows that was actually recorded on video. Let's have a look.
Look, feel, listen. Open your eyes and see. See the world in all its colors. Open your mind and come together. Embrace origins, ages, ideologies, personalities. Every faith, culture, disability and difference. We are all in this together.
لدينا جميعاً وجهات نظر مختلفة وثقافات مختلفة، ليس أفضل أو أسوأ، بل فقط مختلفة، وهذا هو الاختلاف والتعدد.
No matter how we look at the world, to really understand means leaving behind what you know. Go challenge yourself to change yourself.
Muvumi wandinali shiba abantu abapusana. Elo kunjito de kumanya abantu abafumya kufyalo ifyapusana.
Diversity is not something we embrace because we think it's the right thing to do, but because it is essential to reflect the world as it is.
Change yourself to change the world. Build a future that creates equal opportunities, equal rights for everyone.
Diversität ist auch harte Arbeit, weil es bedeutet, dass wir uns von unseren Stereotypen verabschieden müssen. Jeden Tag, zu Hause, im Beruf, in unserer Gesellschaft.
Almanya'nın uluslararası kamu yayıncısı olarak görev ve sorumluluğumuz herkesi kapsamak, daha iyiyin ve gerçeğin sesi olmaktır.
Embrace difference because it gives perspective. Embrace difference because it lets us finally see.
Unterschiedliche Perspektiven und kulturelle Hintergründe, hohe fachliche Kompetenz. Dafür stehen die Kolleginnen und Kollegen des CR Council, die mich in meiner Arbeit in der Chefredaktion beraten. Wir diskutieren, wir streiten, wir sind konstruktiv und wir arbeiten gemeinsam an den Inhalten. Denn Vielfalt ist unsere Stärke.
Open your eyes. See the world in all its colors. Open your mind and come together. The world is not made of one, but everyone.
All right, so actually watching that video made me a little emotional because it presents a sort of idyllic world that I think we all are aspiring to. But Zahra, is diversity enough to stop stereotyping?
Definitely not. Diversity is like breathing air. It's around us anyways, but what we need is inclusion and is this way to collaborate on an eye-to-eye level. And the CR Council mentioned in the video, Chefredaktion is CR. She's not making decisions as a leader on her own desk, but she has this team of different perspectives, which means more effort, more feedback loops, more discussion, more friction. It's not a party every day. It's a muscle that we, as I said, constantly need to train. Then it can become a strength. But it's also not something that is harmful for our social cohesion, the other extreme that is often portrayed when we talk about diversity, that it will split us into groups and only foster ideologies and identity discourses. No, it is something natural, it is around us anyways, but it's not about having everyone together in the cafeteria, and then as higher we go in the hierarchies of our organizations, this diversity is fading. So what we try to do is to work on the patterns, the individual patterns of our individual brain and decision making, but also the structural patterns.
Okay, I'd like to take a question from someone online, and then I'll open the floor. So when do stereotypes become harmful, asks Nusrat Sheikh from Germany, and what is the impact when media is stereotyping a community? Please give examples. Thank you. Adam, do you want to take this one?
When are stereotypes harmful? I think that question is harder to answer than it seems. So Moky and I started discussing this, and I agree that many stereotypes can be harmful, and I'm not sure I can draw the specific line, but one of the things that I started saying earlier is whether they have an evaluative component. So as soon as we see that some group is amped up and praised for something just by virtue of belonging in a certain group, or even worse when it's negative, that will certainly be harmful. So that's a thing we can pay attention to. Is this stereotype saying this group is better or worse, especially good at something? That's probably a point where we can ask ourselves whether we want to apply this stereotype, and that we probably don't want to.
Okay, we have 5 minutes. Eddie, you have a question. Then we'll come here and the gentleman at the front. There should be a microphone. Oh, behind you, the gentleman's.
Can you stand up, please?
He's standing up. He has a colored shirt. Eddie, use your big voice to announce yourself.
Which big voice? So my name is Eddie Micah Jr., journalist with Deutsche Welle, and I find this very interesting discussion. The thing with stereotyping is, I think I would love us to get to know how to deal with it on an individual level, very personal level, because there's also different types, right? There's the covert, very clear, and there's the overt. So, for instance, as a black man, you get asked a lot of questions, even when you speak in English. Oh, where are you from? Ghana, Africa? You speak very good English. I'm like, oh, you're surprised? There's that. And then you go into the trains, the tram, and then, you get in and some lady just picks the bag and clutches it to her chest because, you may snatch it and run away. Or you're walking around sometimes somewhere and someone says, hey, you got weed, you got cigarette, What do you do in such situations? Do you try to address it? Do you try to talk to the person, try to educate the person in a way? Or you just, be silent about it? Because, little drops of water, they say, make a mighty ocean. Do you go to that education personal level? Or what do you do in such situations?
All right, we had a question here. Yes? All right, as we're waiting for the microphone, Moky, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting dilemma because it's something that you have to address as an individual. To give you a quick example, my husband, he works as a geotechnical engineer, and he used to be on building sites, but he used to be dressed as a worker. Everybody often came up to him because he was black. They assumed he was one of the workers. He was actually running the site, and he never ever told anybody. He couldn't be bothered. That was his way of dealing with it. It's your problem, you deal with it. So I think each situation you need to determine whether or not it's worthwhile. Personally, as Moky, I will always deal with the situation. I just have a different approach. But in the newsroom, I think we need to be putting our hands up when we see things that are not right, and also I think the way to make sure that we as journalists don't necessarily go in and do those same, things, we don't stereotype people, is that when you go in and do a story, be aware of your own privilege. Be aware that if you're covering something, a war situation or an IDP camp, you don't live that life. So don't come with your personal biases and you tell the story from that lens. And the last thing I will say is I'm always sort of saying, who is the hero of the story? In African stories, the hero is the poverty, it's the malnourished child, it's always the negative. And maybe we need to think about how those stereotypes push out the stories that we currently tell. And in that case, I would say, stop, think, am I feeding a stereotype? And if I am, how can I tell this story differently? Or, better still, how can I tell a totally different story about Africa?
Stefan is in my ear and he says we have strictly 3 minutes. So we'll take the question and wrap this up.
Can you hear me? Thank you so much for the opportunity. My name is Sani Abdurrahman, also from Ghana, like Eddie. So just this morning when I was boarding...
We have 3 minutes, please.
Yes, the bus to here, 4 of us, I was the only black person. They entered. When I entered, the bus driver asked, "Where's your ticket?" I said, I'm a guest of the federal government and I don't have tickets. I was angry and I gave that answer. But the issue of stereotyping, I think the international media is so interested in negative stories about Africa, for example. As a local correspondent, if you pitch any idea to the news organization, and it's not so negative like she said about malnourishment, poverty, fighting, wars, and those stuff, they hardly even commission the pitch for you to do the story. But anything negative that you pitch to the editor, quickly they commission and tell you, go ahead, get us pictures that you know will tell that kind of story. And it appears that's what the international audience are even interested in seeing. So I'm happy that Deutsche Welle is talking about constructive journalism, but it's a long journey that we have to work towards.
All right, thank you for your statement. Stefan, I just want to check with you real quick. Can we have 2 more minutes? Okay, we can have 2 more minutes so I can have an answer from the gentleman here. He's been raising his hand. Did you have a question? I just negotiated hard for the 2 minutes. Let's make good use of it. Yes.
به نام خدا رحمت الله بیگانه هستم یکی از خبرنگارای افغانستان که 20 سال در افغانستان فعال بودیم در بخش‌های مختلف.
Excuse me, are you...
Translate.
Oh, can you translate for us?
I'm not a Dari speaker, but if we have a Dari speaker in the room.
I believe the gentleman next to him is.
It's an honor and privilege being here, and for a short time, just I want to catch attention about the crisis, as the forum is about the crisis of Afghanistan, about the world and the journalism. I want to tell that at the time, this in Afghanistan, there is a lot of problems facing the women journalists that they are going to presenting in newsroom with a face mask, and they are day by day isolating and disappearing because of if we have a value and for freedom of speech, I am seeking everyone who is here, they can help us in Afghanistan for keeping the values of journalism and with decisions that can help. If and if I respectfully ask you that put your face mask and continue presenting for 2 minutes, it will feel that it will really. And also, I have a thank you from appreciation from Degenerating.
I think we have to take that at a later point. I'm so sorry. I know that this is really, really important to you, but unfortunately, this is not the forum for it. Zahra?
Yeah, maybe to connect it to the discussion, to sum up, he's stressing the point that we didn't mention yet, the question of power. And when does a stereotype become harmful? When we take power away from people and when we exclude them. And this is an excellent example.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up. Okay, and so as we conclude, I'd like to ask my panel to give me some solutions, a way forward, so that the next time we get into these harmful stereotyping, we're able to catch ourselves and hopefully prevent the stereotypes from being perpetuated to our audience. Moky, let's start with you. I know you talk about ethical reporting.
So we've got 2 things that Africa News Filter that I think can help. One is we've just funded a storytelling course with the Thompson Foundation to teach journalists how to do storytelling, feature-style storytelling, which we're finding a lot of African journalists come out of, journalism school, knowing how to tell hard news that's right here, but those sort of feature stories, human interest stories. So we've done that course, that's the first thing. We've also got something called an ethical storytelling handbook, which, to quote Binyabanga, we've called it How to Write About Africa in 8 Steps. It's things like understanding the power dynamics and the relationship with people you're covering. So there's like really kind of simple steps journalists can take. So it's a worthwhile handbook to download and have a look at it. It's on our website, africanofilter.org.
Caleb Okereke, what can we learn from what Minority Africa is doing?
Can you still hear me? It's raining very heavily now.
Yes, we can hear you.
Awesome. So I would say what we're currently doing is we're still maintaining the digital publication, but we've also launched a fellowship program that's kind of engaging journalists from minority communities to allow them to tell their stories by themselves. So the very first thing that I would say we can learn from that is to constantly and actively engage the communities that we're trying to change stereotypes about, to platform them, to recognize that we are not the voice and we are never the voice. And also, like in many other instances, I think one thing that I would also say is I see like a lot of cost and reaction, like sort of like reporting. So like someone says, oh, like you don't have language, and we say, oh no, we have like many languages, like Toni Morrison was saying. But what I think is a much more sustainable model to that is to constantly tell fuller stories, wholer stories, right? So what we do is solutions journalism and kind of like constructive journalism as well. So when we tell fuller stories, we're able to counter stereotypes by just telling the whole story.
All right, thank you for speaking very fast so that you can conclude in time. All right, Adam, it's up to you, your turn.
So I guess one thing I can contribute is what we know from research is that counter stereotypes work a lot better to counter stereotypes, ironically, no pun intended, than to tell people not to stereotype. So it's one thing to tell people, please don't, call women emotional. That is much less effective, at least in empirical studies, than telling people, look at this powerful woman, or look at this really rationally thinking woman.
Okay.
So confronting people with counter stereotypes is usually a very effective way of making them realize that their stereotypes don't work, and much more effective than trying to tell people not to stereotype.
All right, thank you very much. Unfortunately, that is really all the time we have. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me thank our panel today, Zahra, Nedjabat, Moky, Makura, Caleb Okereke, and Adam Han.